And we are live. You didn't say it. We got some people already in here. What's up, Fox? Thank you. Yeah, put me in the game, coach. What's up? We got an individual. Hold on. Let's see if we can get this thing up. Hello. All right. Yeah. So today, we are back with Ignis, and not only are we with Ignis, but we have another guy who's about to say something in a minute here. But today's topic, right? Well, first of all, I got to admit something real quick. I like milk, right? Okay. I had my Milkies with me, and I have them in this glass. My name is Ahmed Mlih. I host the show Civil Offense, and today we are talking about capitalism and communism. What are those? We'll be answering what they are. First of all, are they compatible with anarchism? Ancaps or ancoms? Who are the real anarchists, right? We'll be addressing those questions as well as ideological perspectives on what anarchism is and figuring out how accurate those views are. So today I am with, first of all, Ignis. How you doing, Ignis?
I'm doing all right, What do you mean by you had your Milkies? You just had like your Milkies on hand? Your glasses,
nice
do you call your glasses of milk Milkies, or is that something else? Is that where you got it?
No, I have Milkies, okay?
Oh, okay. So
but
did you take
I also
some
have this
of
glass of milk here.
I see.
All right, and then we have Ancat in person, live. I don't think he'll show his face, but he's here. It says I'm echoing. Do I sound like I'm echoing?
Oh.
I mean, there's maybe like a little bit of a reverb or something.
Probably through the other mic, right?
Possibly.
Maybe. Is it bad? Let me know.
I could try maybe sitting further away, potentially. That could work.
Yeah, perhaps. Maybe when he talks. Is it me that's echoing, or is it when Ancat talks that he's echoing? All right, we'll get that answered in a second here. Yeah. Now, first of all, before we figure that out, we're just going to go straight into it. What is capitalism? I mean, I guess that's kind of a broad question, but it's perfect for the stream today because that's kind of what we want to talk about. But Ignis, I think I'll let you go ahead first.
I would say I would go with Hoppe's definition in his theory of socialism and capitalism, where capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production, or private ownership of the market.
What does it mean? What do you mean by private ownership?
What I mean by private ownership is individual ownership over these things, means of production being mostly capital goods, external to oneself. But an important factor is that one of the major factors of production is labor. And if you're going to say that the public owns the means of production, labor is a means of production, and that the public would then own labor, and labor is just the actions of your body, so the public would own your body.
Okay. I guess I'll let Ancat go ahead on that.
So would that include or exclude state ownership?
The state is a public entity, so
right. But like, if we're talking about like monarchical governments, like Hoppe, for instance, talks about, with that, like, because he calls, for instance, like monarchies private in that sense.
I mean, it depends on how you're going to go about defining a monarchy, because
right.
In certain ways you could say that it is owned by one individual. In a great many ways that you can say that it isn't, because that no one person like holds all the keys to power. The keys to power are distributed among the king's court and everything like that, and that gets into a bit of the wider political theory.
Right.
But
okay, so I suppose I would ask, like, how does somebody own something under capitalism?
I mean, to own something, you would need a valid property claim, and the valid property claims, to my knowledge, are only consistent. The only system of consistent valid property claims would be libertarian natural law, which is the claims specifically contained with it would be homesteading. So being the first to implement unowned resources as a means. If I pick up a stick from the wild, no one's ever used the stick before, and then I implement it as a back scratcher, I then own the stick.
So would you say there's some sort of, like proof of homesteading, as like in some form?
I mean, in order to act out these property norms in reality, you need to have it on the basis of standards of evidence. So evidence of me being the first to homestead the stick, I could like carve my initials into the stick or something else like that. But in order to convince other people that I in fact did homestead the stick rather than someone else prior to myself, I need to make a mark or in other way have an objective thing to point to rather than just my own claim that I was the first to do this.
Yeah, were you continuing to answer that question I was asking before though?
And then aside from homesteading it yourself, another way to acquire resources is by voluntarily trading with someone else. So if I have my back scratching stick and I decide to give it to you for a slab of 1 pound of pork or something like that.
We keep it halal here though.
We keep it halal. But if I wanted to do that, you're within your rights so long as you truly own the pork, and I'm within my rights so long as I truly own the stick to trade it with each other. And then you gave me some meat for my stick.
The fox says, carve my initials in a stick. So if I carve my initials into a virgin woman's ass, can I claim ownership?
No, you can't.
No, that's a person. Well, actually, okay. Yeah, I guess what differentiates a person from other property then?
So a person is a scarce resource just like any other. What is different about a person is, I forget the exact proof when it comes to the origination of property over oneself. But it could simply be just that once you have your conception, you implement your own body as a means in order to build itself out further, you being the animating force of the cells that first began you. But that is, I'm probably not doing it justice because of this. I haven't looked up too much into. But in terms of other libertarian, it's not necessarily like the origination, but a proof that you can't argue against it without contradicting yourself. When you engage in argumentation with another person, one of the reasons that you are engaging is because you believe implicitly through your act that they have ownership over themselves, in that they're able to engage in this argument to try to find truth, to try to. Man, I'm not doing this justice right now.
Well, hold on. An individual commented something. He said, I'm not going to go through all the comments right now. I'm just going to go through this one first. Hold on. Let me see if I can pull it up. Okay. For some reason, it's not doing it. Oh, there we go. Well, they have potential to, where an inanimate object does not. Because I guess the fox said, he was saying that it hasn't been owned or used. And yes, a virgin woman's a scarce resource. But if they cannot demonstrate moral agency. So yeah, he said that. Zach, what's up? I'm going to get to your question in a bit, but yeah, thank you. Thank you for the love on the glass of milk. I love it too.
Well, just on one thing, I would just say that the idea of trying to homestead a person kind of has the same problem as trying to homestead already owned property.
Yeah.
Because right there, you're directly initiating conflict, and you can't really separate your own self from your own person in the same way that you could, for instance, trade a stick. So regardless of someone, it's sort of the same problem with trying to sell yourself into slavery. You can't really essentially what selling yourself into slavery is doing is essentially you saying that at some point in the future you can basically do anything. You can essentially do anything that you want to me, even if I retract consent. So it's basically the idea of saying that at some point in the future I can I voluntarily have the ability to not consent to things in the future, or have people be able to do things to me without my consent.
Mm-hmm.
But for if we're talking about generally the idea of rights, consent has to be sustained. So you can't just say if you're on your deathbed, for instance, you can't say, okay, in 20 minutes you can lethal inject me, even if I say no. You have to continuously say, okay, are you fine with turning on the lethal injection? Are you fine with actually putting in the chemicals X, Y, and Z through each step of the process? So consent has to be sustained.
Yeah.
Hold on. Yeah, I figured out how to get rid of the echo when he's talking. I just got to press mute on myself, and I can do that pretty easily. So we got that covered.
Right,
but yeah, deathbed. It's like Family Guy funny moments. He's
Right.
saying his last words.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say is, I would hold self-ownership as true. I don't think I've reviewed the theory enough to adequately defend it as a proposition, in terms of its origination from conception, birth, the start of a human being. But I could talk about everything that proceeds from it.
Okay.
Right. And I think one more thing to point out too is that I think if we're talking about, what is the distinction between like libertarian claims on, property rights versus pretty much all others, is that libertarian property claims can only emerge through, through purposeful action on scarce resources. It's the action that demarcates your claim to property. Whereas basically all other claims, whether you talk about like liberal claims or Marxist claims or, other forms of like, other like statist forms of property, is that property comes from just, I wrote down on a piece of paper that I own the property and now I get it, I said that I own the property. Therefore, so essentially for other non-libertarian claims about property, their claims are fundamentally distinct from human action. And I think that's like a very fundamental thing to highlight at the very least. And I think that alone honestly makes, even if some, libertarians may not like be fully down on the theory in some cases, I think that makes automatically libertarian claims to property a lot stronger than basically anyone else.
Yeah. It's usually just by fiat or by some reasoning that's similar to libertarian, like the libertarian homesteading was built upon the idea of like the Lockean homesteading, but made a bit more precise and refined.
All right, so we got Legacy Zach. I wanted to answer his question real quick. He said, thoughts on how one articulates their claim during a dispute upon that land? Which is an interesting question. So I assume he's saying like, okay, basically, how do you display a claim that you have to land?
It would typically be to show the means that you use the land for. So if you're using the land for grazing animals, you've built a fence around it, you have the animals upon it, and so you're using it for that. Other than that, say just like a recording of just like, hey, I found this land, everything like that. It depends on like or just like you want evidence that you have homesteaded this land. Outside of that, if you don't have any evidence to your property claim, then your property claim is pretty much worthless. Even though it may still be true, like if we had an omniscient God who could resolve every single dispute and tell us what is the case definitively without a doubt, then we wouldn't have any need for standards of evidence at anything. But we live in the real world, so we have to have standards of evidence.
He'll tell us who owns Israel for real.
That's one of the things too. When it comes to like the Israeli land claim, I heard someone say it's just like, well, if the God of Israel is true, then him granting them the like divine right to Israel would be a true property claim, definitionally so. And what I would say is he could have granted you the land, you still must have a true claim to it, such as either homesteading any part of the land that hasn't been implemented as a means before, which I don't know how much is left of that. I'm guessing there's not much left of that. But otherwise, through voluntary transaction, acquiring that land. Which, boy, that would have been a lot more peaceful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this was something like during the stream I wanted to pick your brain on, was sort of the idea of land titles, because there have been debates, even going back to the early 19th century, from libertarians arguing whether land counts as a legitimate property claim. I'm a bit more skeptical of it, mainly for the reason that, well, first of all, if we're talking about like giant land titles, so for instance, like this rich guy who, owns like 1,000 acres of land, that he hasn't even touched upon, right? Like that's a clear example, for instance, where you've seen basically, he hasn't even seen the land, he hasn't acted upon the land, he hasn't used the land really as a, acted upon the land as, employed it to his ends. He's really just getting this decree from the state that says, okay, you have the title, you have the deed to the land, this sort of arbitrary box of land. So that was sort of one of the first things that made me skeptical of the idea of, well, these giant land titles that we see today existing in a world without these legal titles. But I also started to see problems with the idea of, what, for instance, could you do to the land, a patch of land that would demonstrate that you can exclude others from the land. So, for instance, it's a lot easier to see how you can do this with, for instance, a spearfish or like a stick for either soaking one's fire, or using it for spearfishing. Right? Those are completely contradictory ends. But if we're talking about something on land, right? Like me building a house on this patch of land, and then someone else building another house on the patch of land, those aren't really contradictory ends. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what can you do? What specifically would you have to do to the land to actually demonstrate that you own it? Because I've also had problems, and this is kind of the last point that I'll make. I've also sort of had problems with the idea of like, oh, well, I fenced in the land, so technically I own the land inside it. Well, I mean, that kind of presents problems where, okay, would jumping over it be fine? Is me, if I were to able to actually act upon the land inside, the only thing I've really demonstrated in our mind seems to be just the fence, not really the land inside of it. You're not even using it at that point.
So what I would first like to point out in terms of like, is land a thing that you can have valid property claims over? If you were to take the proposition that it isn't, land in this context is equivalent to all natural resources because all natural resources existed like upon land. So that would be all trees, lumber, all of that is considered land in this sort of context, because for you to acquire those natural resources, you must act upon the land for which it came from. And that's the issue that I have with Georgism, because Georgism is that land, and thus natural resources, cannot be privately owned. They are owned by all in common. So any act to make them exclusive is stealing from the collective, and therefore we can have this state oversee this land and then just tax the
Right.
people because you must make it exclusive to some extent to, live. So we'll have this land communism where the state gets to control, where the state has ownership over the land and thus can give it out how they see fit and tax it how they see fit.
Real quick, I just made your mic a bit louder because I think it was like kind of quiet. If anybody in the
Okay.
chat thinks that you're at a good volume now, if Ignis is at a good volume now, type niggas in the chat.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Do you want to finish your point, or?
There was that point about land communism.
Right.
Then in terms of the fence sort of situation, when you build a fence upon a piece of property, you are making it exclusive. You are building a barrier as the objective external thing to point to say that this is the area in which I have made exclusive. If you are intruding upon it, like any form of trespass, or what's called a tort, which is the trespass of property, any form of trespass, including property, is the contradictory use of that space because the original owner would rather have that space been free. And then if you are entering upon that space, that is a contradiction in that you want to occupy that space where they want nothing to occupy that space. They would rather have it be free.
I see. Okay. Well, I think to touch upon the Georgism point, I definitely do agree that like Georgists are retarded. They're basically just left-wing minarchists, I mean,
would
and not
rather
even
a
that.
Georgist law than every other law. Like if I had a
Right.
choice to live in a country with that, but like still it's land communism.
Yeah. But I think with land, I mean, for instance, there's a difference between occupancy and homesteading, right? So for instance, like, two people can occupy a patch of land and not homestead it. So for instance, like Native Americans, for instance, two native tribes are both using a river to fish. Both tribes can occupy the land. It's not common ownership, because obviously, like, we know that common ownership is impossible, right? Like, I mean, we both agree with this, but there is
They
such a
can
thing,
act
I
as if
think.
it is true.
What was that?
They can act as if it's true, like, oh, we all own this in common, but it's just like,
Right.
well, no.
I mean, you could, yeah. So for instance, you could have like one guy own it, sort of like the state does, because for instance, like when the state owns a public park, it's not even really technically common. It's more just the state owns the park and then lets whoever they want, to use it. So it is still technically like a singular owner. But like I could see instances where you could apply this sort of same standard to land. I think where you have occupancy of the land, so people can actually like it's not like both people can go on the land and like cut down the tree. They just, for instance, wouldn't be able to say, oh well, I definitively claim this patch of land and all the resources in it, because that's kind of another problem too, is that with land titles, you'd have to demonstrate not only your ownership to the land itself, but also that you own all the resources inside of it. And with regards to fencing, I'm not like necessarily against that as a standard of property, but I think I'm a bit more skeptical of seeing it as something that like, I feel like that kind of claim would need to be a bit stronger than just I use my resources, and because I completely get what you're saying, but to me it just seems like, okay, well I'm building my resources and just making my resources just around this designated area, but the area itself, you haven't for me you haven't really like demonstrated that you can exclude others from that area, just that you can exclude others from like your fence, for instance.
What do you
Yeah, if I could hop in here real quick, I'm just like, the way I'm seeing it is like, you're creating the fence, you're homesteading that essentially by making the fence itself. So now you have ownership of the fence, but you don't really have ownership of everything inside of it, because it's like, I just have ownership of this thing, not like everything else like inside, because why would I have ownership over everything inside? Why wouldn't I have ownership over everything outside if I decided, okay, this is a reverse fence?
Well, what I would say is, what are you making exclusive? And there's an issue of encapsulation too, and this is an issue with the reverse fence sort of thing. If you are trying to encapsulate other people within your property, you're trying to claim exclusive ownership over them, basically. So where like if you found a sleeping person and then built like a titanium box around them, encapsulating them by like, you own this titanium box and then you place it around them to where you haven't touched their person at all, but they're completely encapsulated inside, and then they wake up and then they can't trespass outside of your box. No, the encasing of the person, the encapsulation of the person is the aggression. You are claiming the rights, claiming exclusive right over their body by encapsulating them in such a way.
Okay, wait. But if I built a dome around Earth, could I like basically homestead all of space?
If you built a dome around Earth, could you homestead all of space?
Right.
I want to do that.
Because I'm just applying the standard that you put, that like the problematic issue there is that there are other people, but we don't know that there are other people in space. So pretty much I'm just homesteading space.
So for that to be the case, there would have to be no actor on the other side of this barrier. So if aliens exist, this is aggression either upon them to like enter, or upon us to like cross the barrier. Outside of that,
I love how like, oh sorry, go ahead.
Engineering problem. But I wanted to touch upon another point too, because you've been talking about like contained within the land. I think something that may be conflated is the like statist mindset when it comes to land ownership, and what I've seen as what is justified under libertarian property norms is that under the statist model, when you own a like plot of land on Earth, you own it from the ground all the way to the center of the Earth, and then all the way up to the atmosphere, whenever space is defined. Actually, wait, no, you own it a little bit lower because we needed to let the planes fly or something like that. You do not own that. You own the like actual amount of physical resources that you use, not just the abstraction of like the space itself. Say just like the topsoil, unless you dig down and use the well or like to build a well, that amount of space. Say like if you've walked your property, you're claiming like, as well as building your fence, making the property exclusive to yourself, then like you own it up to your like head height or something like that.
Okay, so Ancat, if you have anything to that, go ahead. But I'm gonna get a couple questions in from Zach afterward, because he has been commenting some stuff.
Cool. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of touched upon sort of the the interesting topics about land. I was just going to say that like I love how like libertarian debates over property ethics. It's even just this conversation is like 90% more sophisticated than any like Marxist conception of property, because they're just like, well, property exists because the state decrees that it exists. Da, 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 da. They basically have no standard for like they don't even talk about this. They just they just have a very like I don't know, very basic rudimentary conception of property.
All right. So Zach has a question. He says, "What stops a rent seeker, quote unquote, from just becoming a neo-feudal baron?"
If someone sets rules upon their property, the punishment can only be within natural law. You don't own somebody just because they're upon your property, and just because you say, "Hey, if you trespass in this property, I have the right to grape your insides." No. No, you don't. You can remove them from your property. If they refuse to leave the property, then you may use force to remove them from your property. But just because someone breaks whatever arbitrary rule doesn't mean you may do whatever you want to their body, because if they do not consent to the enforcement of that arbitrary rule, they may leave. You have the right to enforce trespass. But if they like agree to leave and leave, then you can't just grape their insides.
Yeah, it seems to be like whatever would be necessary to actually, expel them from the property, and like, raping someone. There's no situation where that would be like necessary to get someone off your property, So I mean, I would agree with that.
You're just having me imagine trying to construct scenarios where that's the case, and I hate you for that.
Okay, let's. I'll just start going through the chats from there. Yeah, Mr. Merchant did type in the chat that you're at a good volume. Let's see. Also, if said person owns an apartment complex, pays to maintain it, and people willingly enter into contract to rent said place, and it's all voluntary, I don't see a problem with it. Like,
yeah, no problem.
To be a neo-feudal baron, or just to do that? Okay, I'm gonna just assume you just meant do that, because like he said also, so that's just why I assumed.
I mean, like an owner of property can be like the monarch of that property. I am the king. I declare the rules. You still cannot violate natural law. You still ought not aggress.
Yeah, I'm gonna like, because I know like the Fox's opinions. I don't think he meant like the part above. It's just I just he said also, so I was like, okay, maybe, but yeah, I mean like, yeah. Let's see.
The only thing I'll comment on that is, I don't know, it just seems like weird for him to like conflate, because for me, like you owning your property seems to be categorically completely different than like even a feudal monarch, controlling a state. So I don't know, like it doesn't make sense to like conflate that to, oh, well, I'm the monarch of my property, I'm the king of my property. Like monarchs and kings to me are like inherently statist, and it's kind of the same problem with like, calling like monarchies private governments. Like to me, even in like the ANCAP conception, private property would be inherently, and I think we've had conversations about this in the Discord too. But like at least to me, it makes more sense to call that like inherently statist.
Yeah, and I would make the point to say that this is mostly just like loose use of the term,
right?
Liberal use of it, where liberal. You maybe you could like declare yourself the monarch. You could say, I am the state, that sort of shit. You can have no subjects, and then are you a monarch? Sure, why not? You declared yourself to be. But you're not part of the anti-productive class because you don't steal from the productive class, basically.
Okay,
you don't expropriate resources from the productive class.
Not that. Let's see. So an individual says, but in our system, how renting works, it's extortionate. Yes.
I would say in part. I would say like the aggressive interference with the market heavily weighs it. I would say in part weighs it in favor of the landlords. And then to the extent that it's in favor of the landlords, it's then in favor of the state because of how many housing regulations and whatnot there are. Like the market is currently slanted to where there is an undersupply of housing and then a huge demand of or surplus demand of towards housing, to where people really need a rent, especially in certain areas, but because of zoning laws, construction regulations, housing regulations, HOAs, etc., and then just general monetary policy from the Federal Reserve and fucking with mortgage rates, yada, 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 you have it to where landlords can charge absolutely what is colloquially understood to be extortionate rates. But then in other ways, the landlord has forced association with its renters in many ways to where like a landlord can't, for any reason, let go of a renter. And then the state mandates some terms of agreement between the landlord and renter. But yeah, it's all fucked with.
Right, and interestingly enough, this is like what the case that you kind of just made is almost verbatim the exact case that like early left-wing anarchists made during the 19th century. They weren't claiming that, and to be fair, like some of them were, literally claiming that like renting is like, like you can like execute your landlord or whatever. But in context, most of their critiques of, for instance, like land rent, wasn't of that that technically voluntary action. It was the artificially propping up of land rent as this conception from the state, and putting these workers in this position of leverage. And this is sort of the problem that I've seen with like a lot of like ancaps, some of the more vulgar ones, like trying to not like completely like simp for rent, but I don't know, it just seems really weird considering like that in a society post-state, I feel like everyone would just have the actual income and the ability to just own their own property. Like why would rent be this common thing, especially like in the way that it's constructed now, where you literally like are living paycheck to paycheck, having to like I've seen like stories of like girls having to be like sexual favors for landlords. That's like that would like exist in Ancapistan. I don't know. It just seems.
What sort of things are you looking at there?
It's true. It happens.
No,
I've seen it.
I've seen like
I was a landlord.
You've seen the videos.
Yeah, I saw them online, dude. Look them up. Look up a girl can't pay landlord rent, has to do a favor.
It was I saw it in a Reddit post where this is like apparently like a common thing for a lot of girls who like can't pay rent. They do like favors for their landlord.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot on Twitter.
Position.
I'm sure there's a lot on Twitter. It's called X now, so just look up paying landlord X videos. Okay, but for real though, I actually have something to add to this. I mean, Ignis, like I know, I understand, and I do agree that like the regulations on the landlords themselves do play a part in this for sure. But I think like a part of it to also acknowledge would be the idea that landlords have leverage over their tenants because of the state and because of the legal system. They have the legal system on their side. Even like, okay, so they do have the cops on their side to kick you out, even if there's like squatters' rights. Like they still can overwhelmingly win in court. I mean, like they just have that like leverage over you to evict you. I mean, like generally speaking, like they have some levels of leverage over you.
I mean, squatting in terms of the United States came about in like direct violation of libertarian natural law. And how I've heard it explained before is that when everyone was moving out west, you would have situations where a person would come upon a cabin that was obviously built by someone else because they don't just appear out of nature. But like no sign of any like one currently living there. It's starting to fall apart a little bit in some parts. So he says, okay, I'm going to stake my claim here. I'll repair this cabin, which somebody probably died eventually just because that happens. I'll make renovations to it, everything else like that. I'll start my ranch or whatever. But then the previous owner comes back and is just like, hey, what the fuck? This is my cabin. Get the fuck out of here. And the United States was like, we got to side on the squatter. And that's not the right answer. That is the wrong answer. The squatter, or like in this case, the squatter, the home improver, owns the improvements to the home. He may take those away if he so pleases. But he does not own like the land itself. He does not own the original cabin. The original cabin owner can enact justice or seek justice for the changes that were made to the property, such as like if he tore down the cabin to rebuild it with other materials, just like, hey, you owe me for the cabin you just tore down, even if it was kind of shitty. but the United States sided with the squatter. So then we have squatters' rights of, oh, if property is abandoned, as in like somebody doesn't use it, where in libertarian property norms, like if the owner just like completely gives up all claims, then it's abandoned to the state. If you don't use it for a certain amount of time, it's abandoned. Or if it's like seemingly abandoned, the squatter can move in. The squatter has rights to stay there. And it's just, no, that's not the case. So the use of the cops to enforce the property norm is aggression on the part of the state. I wouldn't say it's on a part of the landlords, because the state forces landowners to go through them. So I don't have much of a problem of, hey, someone's trespassing on my property, I have to call the state. I would prefer calling a security company, but the final interaction has to be handled by the state. Or, hey, someone stole my phone, car, or whatever, gotta call a cop.
So a few things here. First of all, with the squatters' rights, I was using that to say, like, people may claim to places that are less landlord friendly as like evidence that, oh, well, the state is actually on the side of the tenants, and therefore like there is no like point of leverage over tenants when they're renting. And I just brought that up to say, like, well, there are still other things they can do, like use the police. And I mean, like, you do have a point when you say, like, okay, yeah, they are forced to go through the state. But like pretty much like what my point was is that they have that point of leverage over people, and like this wouldn't be true in like an actually free society. But like, because they have this, like it also changes how they're acting against the people that actually live there, because it wouldn't be the exact same if you were to be evicted. Like, well, I mean, like, let's say somebody somehow was renting, like, and they were, I don't know, let's say in a free society, for some reason somebody's renting, the property owner is like, well, I no longer want to engage in this contract with you. It wouldn't exactly go as it does now. Like it wouldn't be this thing where like, they just show up with a gun at your door and it's like, okay, now get out or else.
Also, like, renting would still exist in a free society, because of time preference, where people don't want to invest the expenditure or anything, or maybe they just don't want to necessarily stay in one place and just hunker down in one place, buy property there. But people would rather have this transient contract where they can stay for a month or however long in this piece of property and then move on somewhere else. And I should have
corrected it, not to say like renting as like any sort of renting, but more so like actual leases with like formal contracts written out. Like, you will be obligated to pay this money to me every month or else you're gone. Like, that's what I mean by it.
Mm-hmm. But what would you say is the point of leverage? And then I'll let him make the point.
Well, I mean, again, like, you don't really have any power to say like if they're like, okay, this contract has ended and like you've been living there for a certain amount of time, like you really don't have any choice but to just be kicked out. And it's like, okay, well, you're kind of screwed, like as far as where you can go, just because like, I mean, it's not like the property prices are really good because of what's happening in the market. So I mean, like you're pretty much not just like, there's not just one landlord that has like leverage over you. I'd just say like in general, like they have this collective power over you. And essentially like, if you're looking for new housing, you're essentially screwed because of that. In the same way that like, if you're fired from your job, yes, like your employer has a right to like stop doing business with you. But if you're looking for a new job, then you're kind of screwed in the market just because like of the way it looks now because of state intervention.
Are you contending that this is aggression, or it's just bad?
I'm not saying it's necessarily aggression. I am saying it's bad. I'm saying like it, like leverage doesn't necessarily have to mean actual like coercion or anything like that.
Right, exactly. And this is like the distinction that I've made between, like voluntary and voluntary, because there are two sort of separate,
you can hear the air quotes.
Right, exactly. So for instance, like, let's say there's a monopolist in my neighborhood, right? A monopolist like phone company, for instance, that I essentially, if I want to have a phone, I have to, make a deal with them and, pay the outrageous prices. In a sense, that's voluntary, in the sense that like, can you go and up and shoot him and fucking blow his brains out because he's, charging you? Yeah, technically, no, she's not holding a gun to your head to say you can make the deal. You have the choice of either not having a phone bill or getting this expensive phone. Right, but in another sense, it kind of isn't voluntary in a sense of like, you have this monopolist completely controlling leverage over you, and the position of monopolist power, because we know that, natural monopolies aren't really a thing. That monopolist power came through violent mechanisms. In a sense, it also isn't voluntary. So, for instance, like, I think a lot of the leftist critiques are valid, but the solution here isn't to like, you know, Papa Cap and Jeff Bezos, the solution here would be to get rid of the titles that are making, you know, these monopolist companies possible. You know, the
Yeah.
state's the problem here.
Right.
Yeah. So I think you point on something that I was going to ask about, like what sort of term are you using for monopoly? And I'm guessing, like from the sounds of it, you mean like state granted monopoly.
Right.
So in that sense, it's like aggressive as they're keeping out competitors. But then what I would also like to say is every owner has a monopoly over their own property. They have like the total right over it, so long as it's used non-aggressively. So in that sense, I'd say just like um, I'm kind of confused in the sense that you are comparing this to landlords, because usually it's the case that whatever landlord got the property by getting enough up and through whatever other voluntary means, acquiring money by interacting with the economy or inheriting it or whatever, which means that someone else further back in the line had to voluntarily interact with the economy. And then they pay the bank however much for a mortgage or whatever. But they, in the only means that they can, voluntarily acquire it, because you can't just like stake it and it's just like, I homestead this, because it is likely the case that if it's a pre-built house or something like that, someone else has homesteaded it. But you're trying to acquire it as best you can, so I don't necessarily see how the acquisition can be like inherently aggressive or anything like that. So I'm just kind of confused by how you're drawing that analogy between monopolistic phone company and landlord.
Well, the analogy here would be in like the various different power relations that the system of like landlordism creates. Like, for instance, that you mentioned earlier, to where, for instance, the state robs your income. For like, so for instance, if we're talking about the industry of landlordism, for instance, like the state, for instance, robs your income through the coercive power of taxation. The state puts you in this, you know, submissive and breedable bargain, you know, position of bargaining leverage, you know, from this landlord position, putting you in a place where you can't acquire your own property. You can't, you don't have as many options in the market as you otherwise would. You could apply this to, you know, any, for instance, like job that you're working at, but you could also apply this to positions of landlordism where, you know, maybe you have only like 2 or 3, you know, different, really shitty, really expensive places that you can go to. I mean, yeah, technically that is voluntary, but all of the relations there, all of the property relations, all of the theft, all of the monopoly, you know, of the monopoly state privilege grants, all of those relations coalesce into a position where, again, it's not involuntary in the sense that like you have the right to like pop a cap in the landlord. It is in a sense involuntary in the sense that you don't really have any other options. And it's not in the sense of like, you know, calling nature involuntary, where it's like you're in a position of nature, and you know, you have to go chop down a tree to, or like, you know, to make firewood. Like, I'm not saying involuntary in that sense. I'm saying involuntary in the sense that this collection of people coalescing in the agents of the state have used, through their human action, violent mechanisms to put you in a position where you have a lot less freedom and a lot less options.
Yeah, so I'm just confused at why this is specific indictment of landlordism, because could you not apply the theft from taxation and the interference with the market to every situation in which you are a consumer, to every economic transaction to which you are a consumer? Just like, oh, I can't buy a peach necessarily from all would-be players in the market because the state intervenes in it, and then I don't have as much money for peaches because I have that money stolen from me via taxation, and then tariffs and protectionism and yada 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 for my peaches or anything like that. Or like apply this to every other market transaction. Why is it specifically an indictment of landlordism, when I would say it's an indictment of like the aggressive actions of the state themselves?
Well, so for instance, I think that you should honestly apply this to like every, you know, most market actions, because, you know, for instance, like the market that you're engaging in now really isn't a product of free association. It's a product of the state coming in and, you know, performing all these unethical actions. And if, you know, if you're asking me, for instance, like why I'm highlighting landlordism, I think landlordism, for instance, is very unique in the sense of like, it's a very different mechanism of power and a very different mechanism of, I guess, economic harm than, for instance, like, oh, well, peaches are a little bit more expensive than they otherwise would be, or like I don't have a choice to go buy peaches from somewhere else. We're talking about actual housing, the place that you actually live. If we're talking about, people in the market currently, like, in my generation, who, where housing is becoming even, way more affordable. We're talking about all these, government affordable housing programs. I think that is a much stronger area of something to highlight. It's a lot more, harmful in my opinion than, for instance, like, just needing to pay $1 more for peaches or fruit or whatever. It would be the same with like, like your water bill, for instance, the problems with those.
So
again, it's not really like an indictment on the landlords. It's just acknowledging the fact that, would these systems of power relations exist in a market freed from intervention? I'm highly skeptical of that. I mean, and for some of the reasons that you pointed out earlier, like the ability for people to actually just have property and have more autonomy in their own lives. They wouldn't have to really like pay someone thousands of dollars a month just to live in like a shitty apartment.
Yeah.
So that's really the only critique,
Yeah. But I think like this talk of specifically applying it to landlordism kind of takes away from the actual focus that it should be on, which are the policies of the state, specifically the zoning policies. Like one of the interesting things that I remember seeing, Ben Shapiro epically owned the libs, where like, oh, housing is so much more expensive. And he's just like, these goods are not homogenous, folks. We have bigger houses than we did before. We have more electricity, more like AC, more appliances, more blah, 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 amenities. But it's not like the market by itself chose for bigger houses. You have HOAs, you have zoning laws that require single family units. So you can't have like multifamily, like duplexes or anything like that. And then minimum square footage requirements to where, oh, you wanted like a cheap house that's like on the smaller end? Fuck you. No. Cry about it. And you just they aren't allowed to construct those because they don't get the permits or anything else like that. So we have this mismatch in housing where you have these goods being produced that the producers of them aren't listening to the true prices of the market, to where you would have a lot higher demand, I imagine, for multifamily units, for smaller houses on the plots, and everything else like that, which would bring the cost of housing down. But you have this interference in the market from the zoning laws, from the regulations, from the monetary policy fucking with mortgage rates, and everything else like that, which leads to the situation where we are, and the poor old landlords who are just scraping by face the brunt of it.
Yeah, and this is something like to highlight too, is that like a lot of people have like kind of the misconception of, well, landlords are just these like evil, greedy, like, and some of them are for sure. Like some of them are complete assholes. But
especially the ones where it's just like it's a business, like it's an entire corporation, and then it's just like you've got the manager and assistant manager who want to waste as much time as possible because they're sadistic pieces of shit.
Right, exactly. But if you're talking about, someone owning some really shitty property, it's not like they're making a lot of money too. So it's not like, but of course you could compare it to like the people who actually have to live in the places and, actually paying the rent. So I don't think so I do agree with you that I think the emphasis should be placed, on the state, but I don't think that really contradicts saying that, like landlordism has this inherent problem to it, and then explaining the reasons why. Because I think a lot of left wingers sort of just say, well, landlordism bad because they have leverage over you. I think what you should mention that, but I think you should, also highlight the underlying causes for it, which is the state.
Yeah.
So I think that's the ultimate critique there. And again, like I don't want to be, limited to just landlordism. I think you could expand this to so many different other areas of life and explain to people
it's true of the job market too.
Yeah, exactly. So just explain to them how some of the problems they're dealing with in their daily life, like for instance, being able to unafford, their next rent payment, for instance, and working at the really shitty monopoly, at the really shitty corporate job, and explaining to them, how these are products of the status mechanism.
Yeah, and
So
oh, sorry.
I was going to say just real quick, because like it's just pointing to this as an example of the problem today, and like how it has become so hard for people to live and exist just normally and peacefully. But I would say like one example I could point to for you, because you're bringing up policy as something that's like, oh, well, that must be the solution. I mean, like, let's say like, for example, like, these like big tech companies like Apple that are making products that, go bad in a year or two. And it's like, then I have to buy their next one and their next one and their next one. Or like, I can't really make my own computer chips or anything like that. It's like, what's the solution to that? Well, it's not really a state policy. There's not going to be a policy, like even if you were from the framework that policy is what does anything, you wouldn't really say like, oh, well, we must stop them from using planned obsolescence to do that. It would be more so like, how can we have the means to create our own phones so that we're not having to buy from Apple? Or how could we like make our own microchips, and then Apple and AMD won't even work as organizational models?
I mean, part of that too is it's not like a different policy is what is going to change things. It's the absence of policy. So like for microchips specifically, because we don't want advanced microchips going to China, the microchip industry is almost entirely regulated in the United States, where you are not allowed to produce unless they say that you can. And then there's tons of like regulations and everything like that. I don't think it's as true, or like it is as important for the lower end microchips that aren't as powerful. But for something that like, say like next generation phone technology, that's going to be like top of the line. You got to go over to Taiwan for that microchip island. And then one of the other points that I want to touch on specifically, as it relates to living paycheck to paycheck, it ties in the job market, it ties in landlording too, is the primary cause, I would say, of all of these. They're just like the biggest cause. It's like, if you look at the percentages, it takes up the plurality, but normies don't want to learn it. But I think they're having to right now. It is the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve that causes this fucking cycle, that causes the Austrian business cycle of just bubbles and bursts, that causes prices to increase. Oh, we need prices to increase at least 2% a year because the people are too fucking stupid to understand that you should spend money. No, if anything, people should be saving more at times like this, and that's what they start doing. That's why you have the shrinking of the spending or anything else like that. So it's just like, dear fucking Lord, learn. I'm not saying that everyone needs to learn the theory and everything like that, but the people who want to be like actively involved in this sort of stuff need to know that the Federal Reserve is like the issue. Nothing else compares. The abolition of the IRS, sure, that would be nice. That would be nice too. Take that second seat to the Federal Reserve, because it is the Antichrist upon this land.
Yeah, and I think this is something that like I've tried to highlight too, is that like the fucking like the business cycle is one of the most important things to highlight, especially to leftists. And this is going to be one of the topics of one of my upcoming videos. I don't know when, probably like I have a few in the line, but this will probably be like one that's going to come out pretty soon, is essentially explaining to leftists, basically just having a plea to leftists to be like, hey, you should adopt the Austrian method, because here's the thing. It's explaining basically all the things that you want to critique, but actually explaining them better without relying on retarded economics, So we're talking about these fucking commies who like want to explain this idea of, oh, well, capitalism failed. Like we have these capitalist depressions every 10 years. No, that's a product. Like what you're trying to complain about is correct, but it's the product of the business cycle. You're wondering why we have these constant depressions like every 10 years. Yeah, that's an inherent consequence, not of the quote unquote unregulated market, but like precisely of the opposite. And you could take, and what I found is that you could take almost any like topic within the theory of Austrian econ that critiques the state. Well, I guess critique is a bit because the method is value free, but analyzes the the product of state intervention, you can take a lot of their these criticisms and apply it to a lot of the things that leftists complain about. And I've talked about, I think, like the ECP as well, explaining like to left anarchists, giving them a lot more of a sophisticated understanding of the state as well. And this is why I think that, like, and I think you pointed this out in like the the Discord announcements, like, oh, which method is the real anarchists? The ancaps or the ancoms? Well, I think they are, to some degree, some of them I think are actually fake anarchists. Whether you're talking about like the police states actually really base, in some of the ANCAP communities, or if you're talking about like the ANCOMs who, we need central planning to create anarchy. I think those definitely are examples of like fake anarchists in those groups. But if you're talking about the actual history of these two traditions, they're one singular movement. And if you apply, if you took just leftist anarchism and ditched some of the retarded economics from the classical period of the 19th century and introduced praxeology, I think you automatically have a more sophisticated understanding of the state.
Yeah. So I was just going to mention, I guess, like with the whole like policy thing earlier with the microchip stuff. So like you're of the opinion that like the best solution here, I'm not saying like the only, but like you think like the preferable one is for the federal government to remove that, like that you think is more feasible of a solution as far as solving the issue.
Yeah. Remove all market interventions, including that one, including anyone where it's just like, oh, we can't have nuclear reactors or anything else like that, or like we can't have some nuclear reactor being developed somewhere else because we need to control it so that nobody else gets a bomb or whatever. And it's just like, yeah, preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons would be good. Doing that in a non-aggressive way is of course integral. We're probably going to reach a standpoint where nuclear weapons are going to be proliferated, whether we like it or not, eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the problem with that one would just be like, it's not like anybody would be able to do it even if the state legalized it. It would be like legal for like the city to build one, which I assume you would say like is fine because like the energy's still there and the city's still building it. Like it's still delivering some of the benefits that would otherwise not be there. I
mean, ideally it would be such that like any person with the amount of like with the capital resources can create the means of production of nuclear power or anything else like that. But it's whatever. Ideally, it would be like some of the new technology where you can't even get a proper nuclear warhead that lasts for any amount of time or anything like that. But probably going to see a nuclear terrorist attack within the century or something, unless we all die.
Yeah, and I've honestly seen a lot more like lefty environmentalists open up to this fact, because this is also probably going to be like another part of the video that I have going over specifically like as a plea to environmentalists why all their problems can be solved through the absence of this the status mechanism. Like there isn't really a dichotomy between either you have the absence of state power and a really shitty environment, or a really clean environment and a totalitarian Nazi state. Actually, it's the problem with these status mechanisms that are keeping new innovations from actually cleaning up the environment and us moving beyond things like fossil fuels. And this is why I've like pointed out too, is that like right now in our current like economy, fossil fuels are basically just a holdover that is that the state is essentially keeping around, for a variety of reasons, probably too in depth to get into right now. Oh shit! I just dropped something.
I mean, one of the major ones is probably to support the petrodollar.
Sounds like the metal pipe sound. You said what?
One of the major reasons is probably to support the petrodollar. Like oil on the global stage is so important for control, and oil being traded in dollars is like the thing that is keeping our dollar in our money or currency rather. Sorry. Our fiat currency from inflating as much as other people's.
Well, it's the thing keeping the state alive. Why don't you think they want to approve more nuclear power? Why do you think they don't want like basically free energy for everybody?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
much cheaper energy.
What incentive would the state have for suppressing innovations at the patent office? Another reason why IP is probably one of like the worst atrocities with regards to the state. But bro, Ignis,
Yeah, IP's fucking stupid.
you're getting really fucking based. Holy shit! Like pointing out the petrodollar, pointing out a lot of these problems with how the state intervenes with the idea of rent and things like that. Holy shit!
I mean, I've always been this based. Come on.
Well, I mean,
enough credit.
I just don't think we. I'll give you that, but I just don't think we've had a lot of conversations about it. But holy shit!
Yeah.
All right, let's
Do
read
we
a
have
couple
some
comments
chat
here.
questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So we have Mr. Merchant. He asked a question that we already kind of had, but we'll go over it. For Ancat and the civil offense guy, if you want to chime in. The civil offense guy, yeah, okay. Could rent, not as it is currently by the state, exist in a free society, i.e. like being in a hotel works, but for temporary housing?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. And I mean, like, even like something not necessarily just like Airbnb as like an organization or like a corporation, but like that same kind of concept where it's like you look on your phone and it's like, I need a place to live. And it's like, okay, well, let me just like get this room for like 10 days or something. And it would probably be a lot cheaper than actually getting an Airbnb. But either way, like I could see that as being like the norm. And it not even having to be like you're looking for everywhere for an apartment. Like this would just kind of be how you get an apartment. Like longer staying rather than just like a 2-night stay.
Yeah, I mean, like there will still be rent, but I imagine that it will probably be more like, for convenience and vacationing rather than I literally need this to live or else I'm going to be homeless. It'll be, you'll have rent, but you'll have rent to like see little space Hubble ships in the asteroid belt, getting to have a view of Jupiter or Saturn,
Yeah. And I mean, I think one of the major things in our current environment, and then also what would necessarily be true in a free society, is that more off-grid technologies or technologies focused on like decentralizing a lot of like utilities or anything else like that would be developed, allowing people to just buy an acre of raw land, and then with much fewer much fewer like costs than lower cost than now. Even though now you can still go off grid for a decent amount.
Not
just
decent.
I mean, like you're gonna need a couple, like over 10 to 20,000 to like buy the land and get your setup going. But if you want to live a decent life out there, then yeah, it's gonna cost a lot more. But I think in the future, not future, but in Liberty Land, where it's every free market and everything, state doesn't exist, it would be fucking affordable as all get out.
Bro, you're just living in Ancapistan in your head. What the fuck?
Oh man, I fucking wish. I wish I had that vivid of an imagination. Awesome. But yeah,
something that I've pointed out as well, and I got this sort of idea from a Rothbard essay on education, where he sort of envisions like education being a lot more like tutor based, to where you're not really going to school necessarily, you're just having like tutors in the home. And I see that as, and he explained for a variety of reasons why that would likely be more like economically advantageous, but I'm inclined to agree. I just think that the tutorship, honestly, now in the digital age would probably be even more heightened, given that like tutorship roles would be looking like sort of how we see on Zoom, where you just hire a professor for really cheap and they
yeah, that's basically what's happening anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Or like you getting especially like without IP, for instance, you having like these these programs where you deliver lectures, for instance, you virtually, or you lock, for instance, your videos behind a paywall, for instance.
Yeah, and that is a form of like intellectual property protection that is non-aggressive. If people find a way to non-aggressively avoid the paywall and access the content, good for them. But for that sort of thing, we're kind of seeing that not in terms of like traditional education, but in terms of like Skillshare and everything else like that. We see that, but I imagine there would be a market for curriculum and then like training for tutors of the specific curriculum. And I would also love to see a changing of the state standards, because boy, the state standards for education are fucking stupid. What is the one thing related to like cellular biology that everyone remembers? That's like a meme of everyone coming
The
out of school.
mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
And it's fucking wrong. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. There are multiple of them per cell. So even the thing that everyone remembers is fucking wrong.
Oh, really? I did not fucking know that.
Yeah,
Damn.
exactly.
Bro, you taught me more than my fucking 8th grade biology teacher.
Exactly.
Unironically.
Yeah.
You taught me more correct information.
Hey, whoa, Dio, hold
But
on.
I was just gonna say, I mean,
Profanity
and
from Diocletian.
no way.
A little,
But I was just
forgive
gonna
me,
say, I mean,
Father, for I have sinned.
that's like a prime example of like the market basically abolishing wage labor in that section, because everyone would just, you know, if they're all teachers doing it online, virtually, they're all their own independent entrepreneur.
Wow.
So it's the proliferation of, you know, entrepreneurship and more independence for you know, independent workers.
Yeah. I wanted to look up. There was this movie made about this like one famous calculus professor, but I can't find it. No, and sorry, not calculus professor. He was like a high school calculus teacher. The movie was basically like he got a bunch of flunked kids, and it's based off a true story. He got a bunch of like flunking kids, and he got them to pass like the AP calculus test. There was a little bit of controversy of allegations of cheating, but they retook the test, and most of them still passed. And he was able.
I read these kids?
I think he was Hispanic. I'm pretty sure.
There was a South Park parody.
Oh yeah. But what happened to him is just such a great example of like the statist market of education, where he was doing such a superb, amazing job that the other teachers around him hated him for setting such a high standard that they took him off like the somewhat prestigious position that he was in. Like they took him out of the like the honorary position. He was set back down, where he was like pushed down. He's only able in this current model of education to teach like 30 students per year, where if he was able to open it up like university lecture, even online, I'm sure thousands of people would love to learn from this guy, see his lectures and everything like that. But no, you're just going to stay in this like little class right here. You're only going to teach whatever students that we give you. And we're going to make sure that you never rise above the ranks, because we want it all to be lowest common denominator for all of our teachers to make it easy for them.
How dare you make a fraction of the population smarter? Screw you.
Yeah, fuck you. Sorry.
Okay, we got let's see, Legacy Zach saying, in a free society with no constraints by the state, nuclear energy would be innovate. Well, I guess, let's see, for positive exploits rather than war scenario. Governments run on violence. Humans would rather live in peace. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of the. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oil gives the dollar commodity since it no longer is valued on some basis of gold. Base motherfuckers.
Sure.
That's an interesting way to phrase that. That made me think, because commodity money is a resource that has an inherent use in itself, as well as a means of exchange of value. And the dollar, enforcing the dollar as the only means to acquire oil, in a sense, makes it a commodity only via aggression. And
right
in that like framing, it could then be considered commodity money, except not really. It would still be like commodity currency. It's a currency representing a commodity and everything like that. Like the dollar itself doesn't have oil in it, which you can extract. But the phrasing of like in regards to the commodity was interesting.
Agreed. Did we go over Ancat's definition of capitalism earlier, or did we just like respond to yours? Because I
think we just responded to mine.
No, we didn't.
Oh, did you want to go like before? Because we're actually going to move on to communism after the fact. But if you want to say that, and then maybe Ignis could reply to it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had a few. So yeah, I mean, capitalism. It honestly, has different definitions depending on the groups that you're talking to. So, for instance, if you're talking to Austrians, the basically capitalism would be the absence of any kind of systemic status structure intervening on market property relations. So you're talking about like markets, property acquired through homesteading and trading. So
an aggression-free market.
Right. So that kind of capitalism, obviously I would have no problems with, and we would both agree on. There are other definitions of capitalism which I think are a bit more problematic. Ones that are used by a lot of lefties, where it's basically an economic system characterized and dominated by, in large part, private fiat, basically, de facto private fiat titles assigned by a third party, in most case, in this case, the state, or to actors in the economy not directly affiliated with the government. So basically, their definition would be, what we have now, essentially, as capitalism, and then of course there are the there are the problematic people where, whether you're talking about Marxists or some vulgar ancaps, where the definition is simultaneously definition 1 and definition 2. The current free market that we have in modernity. So honestly, I typically don't use the term just because I think I prefer the term Austro-libertarian or like Austro-anarchist. That just is more of a preference thing for me, but I don't. But as long as like ANCAPs are clear with what they're talking about, I don't really care, to be honest. But I think it is important, and it is problematic with, and part of the reason why I don't use the term and why I'm skeptical of the term in general is because I see a lot of people who identify with the label who use either definition 2 or 3. And this is sort of where you get a lot of ANCAPs like defending a lot of these a lot of these corporate powers, like, oh, it's, like what we have now, like basically them imagining what we have now is, and again, like if you press them on this, they will say like, oh, well, I don't really think that what we have now, is a free market. But sometimes in a lot of their actions, they'll talk about, what we have now as if it is a free market, where they talk about, for instance, like the wage gap. Well, in a free market, women can just choose to go to other jobs, or, in a free market, there is no malinvestment. So what we have now is actually fine. So a lot of them will like try to use the Austrian method to sort of defend a lot of institutions that exist now that I honestly think
Are you
that
saying the wage gap
be...
is a product of institutions?
So Roderick Long has made this point. Basically, and
we're getting distracted here, but I'll let you get back to it. I want to hear your point on this first.
Yeah, sure. So Roderick Long makes a few points on why he's not necessarily saying that like the wage gap is, inherent, like 100% inherently the fault of the state, but he's pointing out that like there can be instances where this wage gap isn't necessarily caused by like the wage gap actually is a problem that can be caused by, for instance, people acting in their own self-interest. So for instance, if we're talking about I'm trying to remember the exact like phrase he uses because I don't want to like mess it up or anything, but basically like employers in some circumstances can treat paying their women less as a commodity good. So for instance, some business owners, for instance, might want to have new fancy appliances. Some business owners might want to pay their women less than men, for instance. Or, there are these instances where because a lot of businesses are so disconnected from market signals that this can actually create the, conditions in place where sexist bosses can actually discriminate against their female employees.
And he's saying that this is in our current market now.
Yeah.
What about the employment discrimination laws and whatnot that are on the books?
Like, what do you mean?
Like, if you can prove that you're a woman and getting paid less than a man because you're a woman, you can sue.
Well, how would you prove that?
I mean, that would take like a evidentiary standard of acquiring that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I imagine that like the standard of evidence you have to present would have to be pretty strong, because I could see a lot of bosses getting away with it pretty easily by just saying, well, she doesn't work as hard. or for instance, we're facing budget constraints.
I mean,
I mean,
it's
isn't
not
more
for the
often
better,
than
but
not-
sorry.
I was just gonna say, isn't more often than not, isn't it like a result of like men bargaining more?
Yeah.
No, and I think that's probably an important factor, but I don't think that like critiques of the wage gap necessarily are inherently invalid for the reason of for the reason of a lot of these interventions causing a lot of these, this idea of, well, if a lot of the arguments for the support of the wage gap rely on the sort of idea that the market is free now, that there aren't a lot of these different malinvestments and a lot of these corporations that are completely disconnected from price signals. So again, I'm more in tendency to agree that a lot of it is down to the differences in male and female decisions. I mean, I've seen this in my own life for sure, but I don't think that like critiques against the wage gap are completely invalid.
Yeah, because what I would say is the paleo-libertarian, whatever the fuck that means, defense, or like not even, or explanation rather, of the wage gap is there exists a subset of women that, believe it or not, want to be mothers. And part of that process is getting pregnant and then recovering from pregnancy and then raising the kid. A subset of those women who want to be mothers want to actually raise the kid, believe it or not. That's crazy concept,
That's insane.
Yeah, I know, right? So they are necessarily going to be making less because they're going to devote this labor to their child and to being pregnant rather than whatever soulless employment that they would seek otherwise.
I think women had sexist values instilled in them, and that's why they do it. Otherwise, they'd be liberated.
Yes, of course. And that also, surprise, surprise, being a mother is a full-time job. That's what like the traditionalists like sort of viewed. And to act as if it's a part-time job that you can have in addition to a full-time job and you can have it all is a fantasy.
Yeah.
L for single mothers. But because of this incentive to, because they want to be mothers and raise their kids, work less, they're going to necessarily be making less. And also, if they still want to work even during parts of their pregnancy or soon after recovery while maintaining this relationship with their kids, which is a full-time job, then they're likely going to choose things or industries which have more flexible hours and work more suited towards pregnant women, such as say like nursing and not necessarily waste management.
Right. I think that explanation is valid. I would argue though that I think absent a lot of these businesses who are completely disconnected, from true market signals and the consumer demands of people, I think you would see. I think, I can't estimate to what degree, but I wouldn't be. I think that it's reasonable to assume that there would be a lot more. A lot more women actually getting, for instance, paid what they actually deserve and what they would rightfully earn, as opposed to them getting discriminated against.
What makes you think women wouldn't be paid less in the marketplace?
What was that?
What makes you think women wouldn't be paid less in the marketplace?
I mean, hey, maybe that, honestly,
I disavow.
that's honestly, a valid statement. I mean, who knows? Maybe these, because these corporations are so disconnected that women are artificially being paid more.
Whoa! I saw him hail something when he did that. I don't want to say the word after, but he's like paid more, and he's like he puts his hand up more, like I don't know.
I put my arm up like this, not like this.
They're going from here to here.
Guys, this inflation's going crazy. No,
inflation's going through the roof.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like with bargaining though, I think okay, because of the current conditions, I would say it's easier to be predatory towards women who are less likely to stand up and say I want a better pay. So in the first place, everybody's being lowballed. It's just the women that decide to accept it. I would say more so.
Yeah, I could see that for sure.
Yeah. Men tend to be more disagreeable. If you're more disagreeable, then you won't accept that lower pay. You'll negotiate more, yada, yada, yada.
Okay, so we have the Fox saying women don't typically pick occupations that pay higher, but are less comfortable, tracked in death/injuries at work. Also, they work less hours and they are poor in bargaining for raises. Let's see. Also, women that leave occupations for motherhood don't put in the same amount of on-job time to achieve seniority and acquire higher paying positions. And let's see. So also there is certainly a skill issue, quote unquote, involved in competitive fields such as sports. And
I'd say a biology issue.
Yeah, well, that's what a skill issue could really just be anything, but
everything's a skill issue.
Let's see.
Got hit by a car, skill issue.
Yeah, so what do they deserve? Did the Fox say that? Like less than they deserve or something? I don't know what he's referring to.
I think that might have been referring to like, oh, do they deserve less or more pay?
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. But I will admit, yes, a company can have a sexist male in a position of power. True. However, far more often there are sexist women in positions of human resources that discriminate against men. I mean, yeah, today that is definitely true. I'd say. Like, I'd say that's more common. Like, because at one point, no, but today I'd say yes.
I mean, and
human resources just needs to be completely abolished. Fuck human resources. It is only there because of all like the regulations and shit with the state where it's just like, oh, you can't have a hostile work environment. If I want to be with the boys and start saying shit,
yes,
let me.
What if I subjectively value a hostile work environment?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and it's not like men and women find the same things hostile in the work environment in the first place. Yeah. So you're obviously going to have that as an issue as well. It's very biased toward what females view as like what is like a hostile workplace. Let's see. So the Fox says not a biology issue. There are some exceptional female athletes out there. However, versus males, it is incomparable against males. But in female-only sports, they're fantastic.
Also, female-only sports don't pull in as much attention, because I'd say of the difference of feats between females and males in certain sports. There are exceptions to this. I think women's tennis is very profitable for certain reasons. Definitely not having to do with any noises they make.
Have you seen Ryan Long? Like he thinks that in order to bump up the sports revenue for women, that they should play topless. Because they get more.
They wouldn't get as many advertisers. They get more viewers.
I'm not saying that I would support that, but if the market demands, the market demands.
All right, we got Legacy Zach saying human resources needs to be renamed to wasteful management.
Fuck human resources.
Let's see. So Dio, bro, I can't. Diocletianus. It's he's saying
you good?
Yeah. Anyway, he said in a free market, women would get what they deserve. What do women deserve? So are you saying Ancat did? Or
I'm guessing Ancat.
Yeah, that's what I think. I that sounds more accurate. Let's see. So the Fox says what they earn on the. Well, I guess the Fox is answering the question. What they earn on the merit of their skill and effort. Okay. Let's see. The market demands. Right.
I thought he was going in the direction of like, oh, in a free market, like women get what they deserve. You know, like.
He made like a fist motion.
I was gonna make a similar joke, and I disavow this future statement. I'll tell you, a woman deserves based off of how well she's gonna listen.
Based? Okay, let's see. So Legacy Zach says topless volleyball will now be an Olympic sport. Hell yeah, brother. Okay, so now we're going to get into communism because, I mean, like we did say, this is both capitalism and communism as a stream. We've kind of deep dived into capitalism, but we have talked a little bit about like leftist perspectives in this. So like, hopefully if you're a communist watching, you haven't just quit by now. But, you know.
They have.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, we are libertarians. So let's see. First of all, each of you, and we'll get you both at the same time this time. Let's get Ancat to go first, and then you can go Ignis. What is communism?
So, like, communism is a bit more difficult than I think a concept like capitalism, because just the sort of the history behind it. I think the most common definition is sort of the whole, stateless, moneyless, classless thing. Essentially, it's a combination of a political and economic theory. So it kind of has this weird mesh of like really shitty economics, but also like iffy political theory. It depends on if you're talking about like the anarchist or Marxist varieties. If you're talking about the Marxist varieties, they basically, again, they want the the end they claim to want is anarchy, the absence of a state. But their means to do it are basically just, well, we have to have this transitionary state. We have to have the the workers seize the power because the state can represent the people as long as we get in charge. and essentially think that, after these plans of central planning, we can suddenly get anarchy. And it's interestingly enough too is that this is actually one of the early subversions of and I mentioned this quite a few times before too, but I think it is really important to point out is that, the early Marxists were essentially bastardization, co-optation of the early libertarian movements, because they were essentially arguing almost the exact same thing, but were completely against the idea, or didn't even conceptualize the idea of a workers' state. Their conception of it was to take down the status mechanism itself directly, and not have this transitionary period where you have this authoritarian state, or you try to vie for politics. They were completely against all of it. And it's really interesting how, because you accept this idea of the transitionary state into your framework, you eventually get and also Marxism was a disavowing of ethics as well, because early leftist anarchists focused a lot more on ethics and property as well, and we can get into that as well, their positions on property rights. But it's interesting how you can, when you essentially co-opt that framework into a statist mentality and accept that transitionary state, you essentially, 100 years later, you lead to, the disastrous ideas of, Marx-Leninism and Maoism and, all these other basically tanky variations of communism, and that's basically what communism is now. And that's what most people refer to when they think of communism. But there are other variations, existing today, who are actually, again, it is really weird to say it, like, anti-authoritarian communists, but they actually do exist technically.
All right, what I got from that is that the Marxists want to trans the state. All right, your turn, Ignis.
Yeah.
True.
What I would say is, going back to Hoppe's dichotomous definitions between capitalism and socialism. Socialism is the public ownership of means of production. What I would say communism would be is the public being defined not by an entity that takes the role of the public in terms of like the central planning and everything like that. It is the point of the iterative development of socialism where humanity has achieved the species being, and all central planning, rather than being centrally planned, is in effect decentralized central planning to the species beings to act in a way that is best for the species rather than themselves. And I think the species being idea is an integral part of communism.
Thoughts on that?
Because,
I thought you were done.
Oh, I could continue a bit more, but it's just like,
go ahead.
without to have like an anarchy, to have the public property norm without the enforcement from some being, you're going to need this magical property of man to act not in his own self-interest, but in the interest of the species, as if he were a cell of an organism.
Zach says communism is the fallacy of utopia.
Yeah, I would say that. It's why I have a lot of contentions with a lot of left anarchists and like ANCOM specifically. Again, I don't think that they're like fake anarchists. Again, like depending on the ones that you talk to, because even with regards to property, if you actually read people like, Bakunin or Proudhon and, Kropotkin and, other people like Errico Malatesta, all of these people did believe that you had the ability to actually homestead resources and even exclusively own them. They just sort of had this problematic idea of, well, they're flawed economic systems for one, but they had sort of the idea of collective ownership in the sense of like, so for instance, one of the most common ones that they'll cite is land, which I don't think is entirely illegitimate, but I wouldn't really call it collective ownership. I would just call it like, occupation, for instance. They had other problems with, for instance, the idea of the workplace, being democratic. In that sense, it would be, collectively owned in the sense that like, people would, each person would have a stake in the business, which again, I have problems with them trying to sort of prescribe economies, the sort of idea of, well, the economy would look this way, absent a state. And I have issues with most people who try to do this, but
I don't think too much of an issue. The economy should look this way.
Yeah. And again, it's going to depend on the actual like ANCOM you talk to. If you're talking about like the actual ANCOMs who have actually read, the theorists of like Bakunin and Kropotkin, they wouldn't be in favor of, if I own like a water bottle, I get to like shoot someone because it's, it has to be collectively owned, so it's really interesting because when a lot of the early left anarchists were critiquing, because they were against the idea of private property, but in context, what they were critiquing were the arbitrary decrees by the state. And this is something that we've kind of touched upon as well, is that, hey, if this massive like property owner through all these, eminent domain seizures gets to acquire like 2,000 acres of land, hey, that's not an illegitimate title, but they called it private property. And that's for the most part what they were critiquing in context. But the problem is with our language now, a lot of like modern day, quote unquote, ANCOMs take that to mean like you can't own anything. And this is sort of the distinction. It's why the left anarchist distinction between personal and private property is different than the Marxist one, because the personal versus private distinction is essentially just using different terminology to describe the ANCAP public versus private, or the legitimate libertarian homesteading, aka private property, versus statist property,
so that
or
would
illegitimate
say,
property.
So they would define personal property by like the legitimate claims.
Yeah, exactly.
So would they not?
So, for instance,
then they wouldn't consider like land and business places to be legitimate claims.
I think it depended. I don't know about like businesses. I think they, again, like if you talk with people like Benjamin Tucker, for instance, they essentially thought that like, the business relations which existed in modernity, not that it was like unethical to start a business, just the relations that currently existed in modern day capitalism wouldn't be a thing, which I agree with to some extent, but I also have disagreements with some of their arguments as well. But yeah, so for instance, Peter Kropotkin, he was an anarcho-communist. He gives the example of the difference, for instance, between the state granting someone the right to property versus you and a bunch of friends, for instance, building a house together. Or you, for instance, constructing a house on your own on a plot of land. So he considered your ability to own that legitimate.
Okay.
And for land, it would just more so be the idea that like you need a legal title to back a huge amount of land.
So they were, and again, like they didn't really have very good property ethics. I think that the Austrian school has allowed property ethics to become a lot more sophisticated. What they were more focused on was critiquing the current existing property relations and critiquing fiat property.
Right.
So they had sort of vague ideas on, what counted as legitimate property, but their main concern was basically just critiquing, what we have now and critiquing the state inherently.
Yeah, I get you.
All right. So I guess I would want to, well, hold on. So we could go over Marxism and see what you guys think about that, like as a term, and see if that you would define it as any different than communism. Just, I'll let you go first, Ignis, to see what you have to say on that.
I mean, I would go with, I don't think it's too different. I think they emphasize what Ancat has previously pointed out of the moneyless, classless, stateless society. And that is like the reference in which I was speaking about species being as well, because Marxism specifically uses the Hegelian dialectics, which is taking the thesis, taking the opposite of the thesis, which is the antithesis, and then combining it together in order to form the contradiction, and then from that rise above to get the synthesis. And it's bullshit. It's all bullshit. If you have a contradiction, it's false. Basic Aristotelian logic. Without the law of non-contradiction, you literally can't reason. Like all of the laws of logic, identity excluding the middle, non-contradiction, they all rely upon each other. If you can have a contradiction, you don't have any identity, you don't have any excluding the middle, you can do nothing. Good day, sir. But the Hegelian dialectic is like, we've seen it a lot today. Like the progression from feudalism to capitalism to socialism happens through a Hegelian and then to communism happens through the Hegelian dialectic of, look at the society we have. Is it perfect? No. Tear it down, try again. Is it socialism? No. Tear it down, try it again. And going and going. That is why the revolution continues. That is why that is why, like, in China, the revolution is, I think, probably still going on, supposedly. In Cuba, it like continued on in all of Fidel Castro's life. The revolution always continues because we are not at perfect socialism yet, and we will climb over mountains and mountains of bodies and skulls just to get there, because it will be perfect.
Yeah, and this is actually like very telling and very interesting in a historical concept when you read people like Bakunin, who were, you know, not just critical of, you know, the whole transitionary state, but critical of the whole like idea of the Hegelian dialectic in the first place. He was a part of the first International Working Men's Association along with Marx and his followers, and he was actually, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but he was actually like kicked out. He was basically purged along with all the other actual anarchists from the First International Working Men's Association. And that's actually why the First International is like, you know, portrayed as this sort of like, you know, like state socialist organization, but it actually used to contain like genuine libertarian anarchists. And so like Bakunin was not only a critic of yeah, like the whole Hegelian dialectic, but was, you know, basically if you read some of the letters like that Bakunin wrote for First International, you know, just railing into the Marxist idea. He pretty much predicted the Soviet Union, and he predicted like what Marxism would become, basically saying that, yeah, Marxists, you're not proletarian, you're not like revolutionary. No, you essentially just want to become a new ruling class, but call it the proletarian. And he was absolutely right. But it's really interesting that you like, if you read some of his writings, he is just completely like brutal, you know, and he really is in the tradition of, you know, if you just substitute his call, you know, his recognizing that when he's talking about capitalism, he's just talking about, you know, what we have now, and if he's talking about, you know, private property or things like that, you know, recognizing that he's talking about these government grants for, you know, these wealthy, you know, aristocrats, he sounds pretty similar to a lot of you know, ancaps even at the Mises Institute.
I think I may now lay awake at night fantasizing about what it would be like to see Bakunin railing all those Marxists.
What an image. What an image.
That is a hard pause right there.
Yeah. You were the one that said railing. We were both looking at the camera like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was not thinking of that in the context that you're presenting it.
You don't think about Marx fucking Engels?
Marx and Engels fan fiction, erotica.
One rule 34 of the internet. There's gotta be 100%. Right? How many is my question?
We'll have to check it out on the Civil Offense After Hours.
Considering that a lot of Marxoids are, you know, chronically online, the degenerates, then I wouldn't be shocked if there's a lot of that out there.
Jeez.
How many pieces of like fan fiction are on there? Just
a lot more than just the portrayals.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys both mentioned like, well, I think you did as well, like at some point at least, the moneyless aspect of the society. So I would say like, you know, as far as like the idea of like stateless being a part of it, it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense to us, right? And like classless, I guess you would have to define that, right? But like the moneyless seems to be the biggest one here, that it's like, okay, well, you know, it seems like you're actually going to have a failure here of any sort of interaction if you just don't have any sort of money or like trading between people.
To achieve the moneyless aspect, or even like the classless aspect too, you need that species being. the like magical properties of man, where he's suddenly not man and he's actually just like an ant who's willing to act like an ant and die for the colony or everything else like that. But even more than that, have the knowledge even to act in the best interest of the species. But in order for that to be the case and to truly take according to your need and work according to it as well, or however the quote goes, you need that species being, you need everyone to be a species being, and thus genocide all of the non-species beings. And seeing how that needs the iterative development over several civilizations to go from socialism to communism because of the incremental change of supposedly the Hegelian dialectic. Yeah, that's a lot of genocide.
Yeah, in my mind, it would be a miserable existence to be sacrificing yourself for some sort of greater good. Because, like, I'm sure there are people that are like, I mean, like plenty of the people that sort of view this as a good thing. It's like, well, this is the best for society because, you know, it leads to the, like, I guess, flourishment of the human condition, and like you won't see any more suffering or anything like that. But I mean, like, people would probably be miserable. And it's not to say like, you know, keep things the way they are now, like, you know, but it's more so to say that like, okay, well, maybe we would be better off if people just did act in their own self-interest instead of like having to sacrifice everything for, you know, everybody else except for themselves and live terrible lives that they won't enjoy just to keep the human race going. And if that's what they have to do to live, if that's what we have to do to live as humans, then what's the point? What's the point of living if you have to live a miserable life, die, and then leave it to more people to do the exact same thing? And honestly, like I forgot who this was, but I was seeing like an argument against using like, well, I guess like using policy to protect the environment, because it's like protecting the environment for who? Right. Like, I don't know if you know what I'm referring to there. I don't remember who it was exactly. But anyway, the point being, it's like, OK, well, if we can't use the resources now, if we're supposed to save them for the next generation, well, are they supposed to save that for the next generation? Like, how is what exactly? Like, are we supposed to put ourselves in the worst condition possible for who is the question again? Like I don't think they can answer it.
Yeah, where it's just like, OK, scarcity exists, that we only have access to like the natural resources that we have access to. So it's just like there's the economic question of like how much to extract now versus save later. And that's best answered by a free market. But what I would also say is that same point that you were touching upon, where it's like if we have a responsibility to keep these natural resources in the ground for those who come after, would that not also be true for those who come after to keep those natural resources in the ground, and so on and so forth? And so I just don't think it is all too coherent. I think they are talking about in terms of the here and now. I don't typically understand what they're necessarily talking about. I think they mostly have a point when it comes to land management in terms of forestry, where I think there's pretty big issue of just like, oh, the forests of the world are dying and everything and like that. But it's just like, I mean, a lot of the Amazon rainforest is probably being felled because of the land management of the Brazilian government and everything like that. So don't just put it at the feet of private property owners and everything else like that. But it's just, again, you look into basically every problem, not every problem, but virtually every problem, and there seems to be a state at the root of it.
Yeah, I have something interesting for this. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I wonder why that is. It's almost as if this, you know, a giant organization of warlords with guns and control of all the fiat money in a particular territory seem to control almost everything that happens within it. You know, all the economic exchanges, all the you know, interactions between people. So honestly, it's but it is kind of funny that you're completely right in that, like, you can actually, because of that reason, like a lot of people say, oh, well, it's conspiracy theorists. Well, no, actually, if you look at like what the state is, it's not a shock at all that the state is behind the media, the state's behind, you know, all these giant corporate oligarchies, the state's behind a lot of these terrible atrocities, given just what the state is and how much power they have.
And the state's also why I can't get a girlfriend.
The state is keeping me from having my trad goth waifu.
Exactly.
They're forcing them to go to work instead of being, you know, their prime for me to pick from them. But
you know, the thing having a 6-pack, but that one is actually more true.
The thing is here, I was going to mention, I saw, and this story starts on me like browsing this like Reddit. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
no.
Sorry. But anyway, I was looking at anti-work, right? And I was like looking at some guy's post, and he was talking in some comment section about how like it was very agreeable as far as what he was saying. He was like the state, or I don't know. He didn't say the state. I think he may have said well, I don't think he called it capitalism either. I think he just said like artificial standards have to be enforced for capitalism to be a thing, essentially meaning the economic system, right? I know he meant it by that, but like then he was saying like, okay, well, yeah, it keeps us in poverty, and like it keeps us from actually attaining like better like lives. And then he was just going on this like long tangent that I was like really agreeing with, and I was like, wow, he's actually saying everything right. But at the end of it, he's like, that's why I support UBI. And it's like, really? But the thing with that is like, okay, so you agree that artificial scarcity is something that's being enforced. Okay, so if you all do, first of all, then why are you saying that the resources should be blocked off from people using them? Because obviously that is literally artificial scarcity right there, and preventing this sort of like material flourishment of people. But also the point there being, okay, so now that you don't want people like extracting any sort of resources, homesteading anything, like using it to their own ends so that they can actually have decent lives, now it's like, okay, well, actually, I think we should just make more money and give it to them. And I'm not necessarily saying like, well, if you were to ask a Marxist, they'd want a transition period of socialism. So they'd also say like, give everybody money, right? And like, okay, well, that's a little inconsistent with what you want there at the end with no money. But also the point there being is like, that's your only resource, or not resource, that's your only solution. Like put a Band-Aid on it pretty much. Like you're thinking like put a Band-Aid on it by giving some guy like $100 to buy his groceries today. But yeah, no, just keep him in the exact same position of where he is, like, struggling to make ends meet. And like, he can buy groceries for one more day and maybe a more year, or maybe like for the rest of his life, but he's still going to be living in this shitty condition. And it's like, you're not really saying anything about that. It's really just like, how do we help this man keep doing it?
Yes, money isn't an emergent property of human action. Money is just printed by the government. That's how money emerges. If we print
The only money is fiat money.
Right.
One of the things too, and I know for some reason a lot of like libertarians supported Yang or anything like that, and it's just like, do you know what a central bank digital currency is? Do you know that would be the prime opportunity for them to roll it out? Is if like the only way that you can get Gibbs is if you sign up for a CBDC, and then it would roll out, and then you'd have no freedom of finance or anything else like that. It would all be controlled by them.
Take your state credits and buy your seed oil goy slop.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I think that a lot of like within the state's propaganda is like promoting UBI, kind of for that very reason, is that it's the same reason why I think the state like promotes welfare as well. But I wouldn't be shocked if they're promoting UBI for that reason.
It's a crazy strategy to just buy votes with other people's money.
Yeah,
that's insane to think about, that the state could actually do that.
So I think we've answered this a bit, but we could go into it some more, because I'm sure Ancat at least has more to say on it, but I'm sure you do too, Ignis. Was Marx an anarchist?
No. Not even close.
I like how you sat there and he was like,
yeah, and this is what frustrates me, because a lot of ancoms are like really good, and they won't like say he's an anarchist, but they will actually like prop up Marx as this like revolutionary figure. But even if you read a lot of the early literature from like the first anarcho-communists and socialists, they fucking hated Marx. They considered Marx to literally be a subversion of the anarchist movements. They fucking, I don't want to say like rail again, but they really did completely.
They pounded him.
Yeah. They
they
really
just beat him to submission.
Yeah.
They really did make Marx submissive and breedable.
They laid it down on him.
But what you're not thinking about here, Ancat, is that he wanted a stateless society.
He said that his end goal was a state, therefore he's an
One of the things,
what was that?
One of the things that I do want to focus on is, I think the root of his ideology was that he wanted to sit on his couch, not shower, by the way. Marx didn't shower often. If you didn't know that, he didn't shower often.
That actually is unironically true. He was a legitimate Discord user.
He wanted society to support his theorizing, his thinking. And I think the root of it is resentment and jealousy, that why can't I just sit on the couch and think all day? Why must I actually make money? He should have just stuck with the charity that he was getting, because Engels would support him, his family would support him. He was a real asshole about it. So it just sounds like he was like a resentful, spiteful prick, and just wants society to be structured to benefit him because he just wanted Gibbs. It's everything else was window dressing. They just want Gibbs. Everything else is window dressing.
Yeah, he basically was just this loser who didn't shower and basically just thought, I want to be an academic and a revolutionary, and he read Proudhon's What is Property and thought, how can I take whatever this new anarchism thing that Proudhon wrote and completely bastardize the shit out of it and turn it into this status hellhole nightmare.
So what exactly was the plan for like when communism was achieved, and like what does he think about now for money, or I guess not money, for Gibbs?
Who do you mean he?
Like Marx. Like, so once communism's a thing, like, what exactly does he sit around, getting Gibbs for?
He gets Gibbs for theorizing, which is,
but what does he theorize about when communism's already a thing?
More communism.
Oh, okay. So not straight to the coal mines.
They're just like thinking about other stuff,
communism.
I imagine. Where it's just like communism. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, maybe the next stage in the material dialectic after communism. I mean, I don't know if there is one, but I'd imagine that it's not like the last thing.
Super communism. Communism plus.
Space communism.
Yeah, exactly.
The communism Delta variant.
Yeah. Let's see. So I actually wanted to pull up a tweet. This is, I haven't done it all show, so I'll go on X, finally.
Also, if any communist is still watching, I commend you for sitting through it and saying that your ideology is window dressing.
I would just say to like if there are any Marxists watching, just like, please, if you're gonna stay in that like left lane, like just fucking like, please just read Proudhon, read Bakunin, read Kropotkin. Like their critiques of the state as an inherent problem are going to solve like all the things that you want to, but within a way better and anti-authoritarian framework. And I can guarantee you're going to find a lot more substance from those theorists than you will from someone like Marx. And then also like study the Austrian school. Like DM me and I'll link you some good Mises Institute lectures.
We've also got your website linked in the description all the time, pretty much at this point.
Sweet.
Let's see. So I was going to pull up this tweet. Hold on. I got it. So it's from Anarch, your bud that you put in your recommended channels.
Oh yeah.
But it's actually one that I wanted to show to.
Is it a bad tweet?
Well, it's about Marx. Like it's like we could compare it to Marxism pretty much, like and talk about it there.
Because I do like him.
Yeah.
He makes like pretty decent videos like on the state and whatnot, and critiquing and talking about direct action. But yeah, he does have this problem with not entirely getting that maybe Marx isn't the best theorist to read. Like he doesn't really completely understand the distinction between anarchism and Marxism. He thinks that like some of their theories are compatible, when in reality they aren't, either with regards to praxis, or at least like the left anarchists were against the transitionary state. That's number one. And then number two, Marx and the early anarchists were completely different on ethics. Marx was basically just a relativist, so that's why he didn't really have any critique of the state inherently as an organization, whereas the early like people like Proudhon for sure did, and they had lots of reasons for why the state was illegitimate.
So he wrote 90% of anti-anarchist arguments are anti-communist arguments. Communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. If you don't think it's possible to run a society without a state, then you aren't a communist.
No, because communism like presupposes a lot of problematic economic theories. So that would just be like the first thing I'd point out.
What I wanted to point out was that he said, you run a society, even when it's anarchist, like you're running it as if like, I suppose there is some sort of council or something. Yeah, I'd like to know like what his opinion on that is, honestly, because like, I mean, I was thinking he's like a more consistent ANCOM, but then I saw like this and I'm like, well, what does he mean by run a society?
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem that I've seen with, this is one of the biggest problems within the ANCOM movement, and it is a problem with like ANCAPs as well to some degree, but a lot of them try to sort of just like, unfortunately, reconstruct status mechanisms in their idea of anarchy. It's not a it's not a state, it's a democratically elected horizontal worker federation. It just controls how the property relations of the society are. But you can get away with it by just calling it voluntary. You called it voluntary, even though what you're describing is kind of identical to a state.
Yeah, that's
I
what
mean,
I was.
even if it is voluntarily funded, if it has that same leverage that the state does over you, I mean, it's gonna eventually perform aggressive actions against you. So I wouldn't even call you can't really call that voluntary. It's the same problem with like the idea of like a voluntary government, that like Ron Paul promotes.
Yeah, and what I would say is I'd build off that point where it's just wordplay,
Yeah,
and in order to have like a voluntary government of like the democratically run horizontal whatever the fuck that you just said,
yeah,
you would need the species being, because for that to be anarchism, for that to be voluntary, you would need unanimous consent, um, and thus
right.
a species being would be one who or like these species beings would be ones who unanimously consent to it. Uh,
Yeah,
but that's magic fairy tale land to think that every single man would do that, and that's why within ANCAP you can have ANCOM or whatever. And what people usually just like to say is like, hey, you can homestead a piece of land or voluntarily acquire that with somebody, and then declare that, hey, I don't want anybody who isn't part of this community to trespass to enter. I want to approve like communists to enter, and we're going to be farming dawn till dusk and achieve our stateless, classless, moneyless society, and it's going to be hell.
Yeah. So pretty much, I think we could wrap this up, because we did talk, probably more about capitalism, if anything. But yeah, we could go on about communism, because there was something that Ancat had mentioned before, like last night. He was saying like identity politics was one thing you wanted to talk about. So
yeah.
you could go over that if you had anything on it. And actually, I mean, if you wrote anything else for the show, because I know you wrote some notes as well, we could go after and talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I did want to mention with the whole like stateless, moneyless, classless stuff, is that interestingly enough, like in context, the idea of classlessness was basically just the equivalent of the absence of any kind of like state class or any kind of like gentried land owning class collaborating with the state. So at least with regards to like the ANCAP, or sorry, the ANCOM definition of like stateless, moneyless, classless, like classless would also imply statelessness too. But they also thought that there wouldn't be like these domination, like these dominating hierarchical power structures with like, the vast inequality between Jeff Bezos and like his worker. And then one more thing.
Yeah, and I mean that I agree with though.
Yeah, for sure. And one more thing to comment on that too is that oh crap, I was gonna. Oh yeah. This is a common misconception with like leftists and so of the ANCOM and the Marxist variety is that this idea was not like egalitarianism in the sense that like we would think today, like we're like even Marx, for instance, and this is a problematic critique of it's a bad critique of Marx because Marxists can respond to this by just saying, well, Marx wasn't in favor of egalitarianism. Look at this quote, because he actually did mention in several quotes that he wasn't in favor of this kind of equal, everyone is actually equal society where everyone's making the same money and everyone has the exact same property relations. Because even Marx, for instance, pointed out that there are so many different factors that can make your living situation unequal, whether it's your family structure or where you're born. For instance, if you're born in a rural community versus you're born in the city, there are lots of factors that make inequality impossible. What Marx advocated for was the abolition of all class distinctions, which is slightly different than the anarchist variety, and it's the same thing that like the early ANCOMs advocated too. But it's an important like distinction to make because it actually allows you to argue against, it's that meme where it's like me reading Marx so I can critique him better, or whatever. But that was something
No
that
need.
I wanted to point out.
Yeah, that's
Oh yeah, sorry, one more thing. It is problematic though that a lot of leftists actually do believe in like just unfettered equality, because a lot of them, because they are so distinct from a lot of the original theorists writing, that like I can see how their writings would lead to the sort of modern leftists that we see today, literally arguing that like everyone needs to be working the same and equality is in this sense is just.
Whoa, what are you, a paleo?
Inequality in virtually every sense is fallacious, invalid,
Yeah.
not a virtue, everything else like that, just like in all ways wrong. And I don't think it should be held as like an ideal.
Yeah.
And like, especially when it comes to like, say, like wealth, we don't want people to be equally poor. I want everyone to be prosperous, but that's going to have some like difference between people, because some people are going to be better at allocating scarce resources with alternative uses than others.
There is a sense of equality that I think can be justified, even though I wouldn't really like call it under this name. But it's something that like Roderick Long and people like Kevin Carson, a lot of the people from C4SS talk about, and a lot of the early like the left anarchists. The idea of either equality of authority or equality in rights, in the sense that you have an equal autonomy. You essentially, you're only equal with other people in the sense that you don't have the right to dominate other people in an aggressive and authoritarian manner.
I think that's only like a property of like internal and external consistency of the non-aggression principle. Because if it's just like, oh, it doesn't apply to me, then that's just an inconsistent norm. So it's not true in all cases. So it's just like, that's just a matter of like, that norm would be false. So I don't think like, or like non-aggression asterisk except for me, where I'm allowed to, or something like that.
Yeah, right. And so like there are different ways of describing the same thing, but I don't think, I think it's kind of problematic, because I think you can reach out to a lot of these people who have maybe like semi-egalitarian frameworks, but message them into a way that's going to appeal to their sensibilities without actually removing some of the bad aspects of their thought.
Yeah. And
so
I'm not the type to like
different
appeal to
ways
like
to
the
message.
left-wing anarchists. I'll say
What was that?
I'm not the type to appeal to left-wing anarchists. I'll say
Yeah.
that, or like left-wing individuals to bring them towards anarchy.
Yeah, and I have like qualms with sort of appealing to different demographics. I just think that it's something important, because I think even if you're not going to like outreach to people, it helps you understand other people's beliefs and understand the sort of thought process behind them.
Yeah. Know your audience.
I was just gonna say, like, pretty much on the wealth equality stuff, like, more so it's not about like everybody has the same amount of money. It's just, well, I guess, some people would like use wealth equality to say that, but in my mind, it's just more so like homelessness isn't a thing that's like really known about. Like, it's like, and not just because of the fact that like everybody's ignoring it. It's like, it's just not really like common at all. Like something like that, or like, struggling to make a living is just not something that's really heard of. Like that is sort of like the standard, I'd say, is like, okay, yeah, finally things are right,
Yeah, but I would say that's more prosperity than equality, which is why I'm for prosperity over equality.
Yeah, I mean, like, but I don't think that would really contain people like having like substantial, like, I guess you could say substantial, but like not like, I don't know exactly what the term I would use is, just not like Jeff Bezos compared to us, I guess, is like still the thing we're using here as a sort of the meter here. I don't really think that kind of thing would be like as known or present.
I mean, I don't see any reason why. I mean, like, I see some reasons why there wouldn't be billionaires in the sense that there are today, because many of the ones that are today are here because of IP protections, or like policy that favored them within the market because of the state and everything like that. But I don't see why there wouldn't be wealth inequality to at least some similar degree that we would see within a free market, where I think everybody would be more prosperous, of course, but I think there would still be the equivalent of billionaires.
Okay, so I don't think that there would be, it's hard for me to believe, just given like how much the state props up rich people, like to the degree that they are, and just sort of what we know about state intervention, that there would be these like as wide chasms. And I don't think it's hard. But I do think that it is hard to actually like just a priori predict what level of chasms there would be. But I think that we can say, like, just looking at the current situation, that what exists now, isn't actually a product of free association. So I think we can call out, and we can actually point to the specific examples of how the state causes income inequality. But
Yeah.
obviously, like, I don't think that there would
Or like income inequality, I'd say, is like a different thing, because income, like wealth, is the more important metric to go by rather than income.
Yeah, true. But even so, I don't think there even would be the degree to the income inequality that we have now. Although, of course, like as you mentioned, I think it is important to highlight wealth, because just saying, well, people having more money is objectively better. Well, okay, well, what if I want what if I want more free time and less income, for instance?
Yeah, the like psychic profit and
It
everything.
it ignores people's like subjective preferences, like
Yeah,
and what counts as wealth.
But I
Oh,
would
and this is
say,
go ahead. Sorry.
I would say, like, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't follow like a Pareto distribution in terms of wealth, where you would have what is it, like the 80-20 rule and everything like that, where it's just like it's going to amass itself to where like a small amount of the population, or it's just like the richest individual is going to be way richer than like the person who's the poorest, but within like a free market, due to the technological development from the proper allocation of scarce resources with alternative uses. Technology would develop, like the cost of consumer goods would fall, everything else like that, to where the poorest among us is going to be prosperous.
You did not just say that.
I just said that.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more like back to Ignis's point earlier. I think it's more than just like intellectual property. I mean, of course, there are a lot of other benefits that come with like the corporate structure being like essentially yours to have as like a Bill Gates or a Bezos or whatever. I mean, there are like a lot of other ways that obviously, I mean, we can just go over it again, but like I'll just keep it short by saying like, yes, the state does essentially have a lot of barriers to entry and regulations, and allowing people to have certain licenses and whatever and so forth that allows them to be at that level. But like, I mean, also like just the incentives that come with a corporation being a corporation, like these firms specifically are very incentivized to like just continue scaling upward, as opposed to maybe like a business that wouldn't have people that are wanting to work themselves to the bone to like be at this level. Like, even if that were the case, like maybe they'd want to actually enjoy their life instead of just being drones all day, every day. I mean, also like, I think like with technological increases, I think you see less of a disparity as well, just because like people could start making robots, or like especially like large language models that essentially are doing a lot of the work for them, to the point where essentially you have those drones working for you anyway, so you don't actually have to do that yourself. So if that's the case, then everybody could just do it, and everybody could just basically just start creating wealth for themselves, like through I mean, means that are just not them putting the actual work in. So I mean, I feel like that itself, technological increases would actually like see or help us see like a big decrease in that disparity.
Everyone gets their own auto miner to go to the center of the earth and get some gold.
Auto miner?
Yeah,
No, based.
Bosch be like based.
Yeah. Don't
Okay, so we did want to talk about identity politics, though, right? And Kat, I don't know if you had any notes specifically on that, or if you just wanted to start going into it.
I just thought it would be an interesting topic, just considering that that's kind of like been one of the main things that's sort of taken a stranglehold on the left. And you've obviously like seen it on the right as well. Basically just everyone's at least falling into idpol to some extent. And I think it's very.
But the Jews never would. The Jews never.
No
Hey
way.
yo,
we're really doing a part 2 of the last episode. But yeah, I think it's problematic for a variety of reasons, and I'm sure you have your own opinions on it too. But it really does create this sort of collectivist mindset where you, instead of seeing yourself as this individual, you sort of see yourself as this, this identity group, not only like as an identity group, but we've seen like increasingly over the last few decades that each identity group has started to develop this inherent tie to politics, to a particular policy, to the state. So it's almost become this sort of condition where you are this identity group that you belong to collectively. You have this allegiance to your identity group, whether that's nationalism or identity to some racial or sexual group or whatever. Not only do you favor those people over other people based on these arbitrary factors that don't have anything to do with like skill or merit, just happenstance. Not only do you have that, but you also have every single like identity group being tied to a political issue. So it's almost become that like an attack on the state or an attack on a particular policy almost becomes an attack on your identity in a sort of way. And I think that's kind of what's so scary about a lot of these, a lot of the ways that sort of idpol has been promoted in government schools and, you know, in government media, is that it essentially makes your very identity essentially interchangeable to the state. So not only is society as a whole mechanism interchangeable with the state, but your very identity as a person is inherently tied to the state. And so there's no way within that framework that you can actually become like a genuine, you know, anti-state person, because if you become an anti-state person, you just don't become a person anymore.
Yeah.
You're just no longer you.
I mean, I think part of it is just like the basic premise that a property of your identity determines whether a statement is true or false is just, or that determines the truth value of the statement is just wrong. And there's a midwit response to that where it's just like, oh, what about the statement I am white? And it's just like, oh, that's true for you because you're white, but it's not true for someone else if they're not white. If the subject changes, if the subject stays the same, if it's just like this person is white and that's what's being referred to by I, then it's just like the identity of the person saying the actual statement doesn't change. But I is relative to the person saying it, so that's just a matter of language, but the truth value of the statement itself doesn't change in terms of its meaning. And then combine that with desperate or disparate outcome theory, where if you have a difference of outcomes, then that makes it prejudiced in some regard or biased in some regard. It couldn't have possibly just been however the factors played out. It's because of like actual whatever ism, sexism, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, yada, 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 yada. And then you get that effect that you were speaking about of any attack on any sort of Gibbs program disproportionately affects the XYZ community. I definitely won't be filling that in because my lawyers have advised me not to. Any sort of attack on the banking sector affects the ABC community. Any sort of like attack on public schooling affects the let me just grab some random letters, LGBTQ
yeah.
And so on and so forth, to where because you are against this program for whatever reason that you hold, there's also an added reason of ism to it, of like racism, sexism, so on and so forth. If you're against any sort of like civil rights law, that's a very touchy subject, even though at the root of it is desperate outcome theory, as well as just forced association. The state claiming ownership of your property by saying that you don't get to choose who you associate with or not. We're going to force you to in the name of equality.
Free association, more like you're a racist.
Yeah. That is one of the touchiest subjects, just because, like, you know what the Department of Defense was named previously? The Department of War.
Right.
So it's just like, just because something is named, oh, this is the Bill of Good Things and stuff, and it has like killing the elderly in it, also based, but just because something's named a good thing doesn't mean that it is. The Department of Defense, oh, like securing the safety of American citizens. No, bombing everyone. Just anyone bomb them. No.
Wait, so like, when was it named that? What year?
I forget when like the name change was, but the Department of War was like the name of it prior to the change of the Department of Defense.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I thought it was like the 20s maybe, or was it maybe later or earlier? I don't remember.
I don't know. Probably when America got really war-y.
More than usual, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of ramped up.
Yeah. Well, to sort of piggyback on the point that you were making, I think it is kind of interesting too how like we've always known, I mean, even from the very beginning of, and this is something that early anarchists have pointed out too, is that basically everything that the state co-ops becomes interchangeable with that thing. like that thing as like this Platonistic abstract. So for instance, you've commonly heard the the problem with oh, you don't want the state, you don't want the government running your child's propaganda education program, then you're just against education inherently. So like when the state nationalizes an industry, or what I like to call like co-opting an industry, because they can do it through private firms as well. When a state does this, it essentially, given enough time, what happens is that the very concept that the state is co-opted, it basically, the only way that you can think of that concept is through the mechanism of the state. So the only concept of education is state education. There is no other kind of education. It's just state education. And you can see this with literally the classic, like who will build the roads? Roads are only something that the government can make, or it's the same thing
Just
with
an
money.
unimaginable technology without the state, just like, oh,
Right.
wow, a bit more complicated than concrete on on land. That's crazy. There's a lot that goes into roads, but hey, guess what? You don't need the state to understand the blueprints.
If the state didn't exist, then who would print the money? Because I can only conceptualize money as something that exists through the government.
Yeah, exactly. It's totally not like precious metals exist and were used as money prior to the printing press.
Right.
It's not like there's Bitcoin now. Okay, you have
I'd
to
say-
use the CBDCs.
Oh, you mean this? You mean scam coin?
I'm decent with Bitcoin. Like, I don't have too much of an issue with Bitcoin. I have an issue with it being like public ledger, and then you can like track it across shit.
Yeah.
What really matters is like the Bitcoin to dollar exchange. Like, if you do that with with your bank account over like some Coinbase or some shit, guess what? All the anonymity, it's gone. The feds know who you are, so don't try to buy shit with that Bitcoin. Monero, though,
Right.
Monero has some too. And I think it's still possible for them to like track some like transactions. It's still like anonymized. I think it's better. I don't know if there's any better technology out there or anything like that, but from what I've seen, Monero is what many Bitcoiners hoped Bitcoin would be.
Well, I think what's going to be really interesting with Bitcoin or any kind of cryptocurrency is that it's essentially like what Austrians have been talking about for, since Hayek, or even before that too, is the idea of finally having this this genuine hard money that can actually, well, at least with this only happened only combining the Austrian school with anarchism, with Rothbard and beyond, but the idea of finally no longer having the status mechanism for money, and actually having a genuine money that emerges because people actually want it.
I would say that Bitcoin isn't a money, though. Bitcoin itself has no commodity purpose, so therefore is a currency, and therefore like cryptocurrency is an apt description. It is a means of exchange, and that's it. Like, you can't do anything with a Bitcoin other than use it as a means of exchange.
Well, but a money is a widely within an economy a widely accepted medium of exchange, isn't it?
But that makes it a currency, but I wouldn't say that makes it a money, because the money needs to be in the form of like commodity money, or like the money needs to be a commodity as well. Like gold is a commodity as well, because you can use it for jewelry, computers, everything else of the sort. Bitcoin, its value is in the fiat declaration of the people using Bitcoin, of the market, of people saying, I think it's worth, it hit its like 1 year high. So that's interesting. Maybe the nest is coming home to roost for the Federal Reserve.
Pray to God.
But it is not anything by itself. It is just the means of exchange. So I'd say it's currency, and I wouldn't put as much faith in it as I would gold or silver or palladium or whatever. But it is most certainly, cryptocurrencies as a technology are absolutely integral to transferring wealth across virtual distances or arbitrary distances or anything like that.
Well, I think it's at least more subversive than gold, for instance. I mean, if we're
Sure,
talking
yeah.
about something, that like literally the state can't do anything about, like, oh, hey, give it your Bitcoin. What Bitcoin? You know, like, or put in Monero or whatever, you know, to make it even more private or whatever. But I mean, and again, like, I'm not as familiar with sort of, because I know I'm familiar with Mises' regression theorem, but it still seems to me like if we're talking about, you know, if we're talking about money only in the sense of this, you know, a widely accepted medium of exchange within a given economy, I think Bitcoin, at the very least, in certain circumstances, would qualify with that. I mean, there is the debate of course, you know, whether or not Bitcoin violates the regression theorem. I would just say that it makes more sense that it doesn't seem to make sense to me that money necessarily has to also be used for commodity, like an actual, like, independent commodity, because I feel like if you subjectively value Bitcoin, you know, for whatever reason, even if you're not using it as another commodity, like for instance gold, you are using it and valuing it for a variety of different reasons subjectively.
All right, let's get some chats from the Fox, who has been in here the whole time.
Sorry, did Ignis have anything to say on that?
Oh,
I don't think so. I just remember I had a conversation. I joined like Liberty cells at some point, connected to my local Liberty cell, and some people were like pro Bitcoin, and someone's just like, it's not actually money. And then
isn't
he
it
linked
freedom
to like
cells?
or Liberty cells, freedom cells. I don't know. I forget which one. It ended up being just like a Telegram channel because the website was kind of dead. But he talked about Bitcoin wasn't actually money; it's currency linked to some Mises Institute writers. I forget who the writer was specifically that I looked at, but made a pretty compelling case because it isn't commodity. It isn't based off of a commodity, that it's currency. Its value is in the fiat declaration of the people of the market rather than in its use towards other means within the market.
I mean, I think that's a fine distinction. I don't really see, like, I mean, that doesn't devalue the idea of crypto or anything like that.
Yeah.
But
it's just like it can theoretically go to zero, whereas gold can't. But I don't think it's going to go to zero because it has utility in it of itself and is subversive.
All right.
Yeah, I guess for sure. I think the only thing that I would just say on that point is just that I've heard money defined like differently. For instance, I haven't heard the caveat of, well, it has to have a commodity value attached to it. So I mean, I'm sure probably like there are probably people like in the Austrian server who could, you know, give us a better explanation on it, because I know there have been debates on within the Austrian school, especially recently, over whether or not, first of all, crypto violates the regression theorem, or whether it's a type of money. I'm more inclined, if we're using the definition of, well, okay, well, we're just defining money as needing to have this commodity value attached to it, then yeah, sure. But if we're, you know, going to define money differently, then it seems to me like crypto could count. But yeah, again, that's probably more of a debate for like people more knowledgeable than the you know, in the Austrian school.
All right, so we're gonna get a few quick chats from the Fox. I freely associate with you guys, but I'm sure that offends my personal FBI agent. OMG, who would defend us from robbing basketball people without the police? All right. Anyway, so I think we gotta wrap up here, guys. But I want to hear your last thoughts real quick. And yeah, so any last thoughts on the episode? First of all, Ignis.
Last thoughts would be the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. But read your theory. I was a little bit under prepped on some of like the proofs of self-ownership and whatnot, but it's like always good to read theory. Don't get too deep down into it. A lot of it is still being developed, so don't get too hard on yourself for not knowing it. I'd say I'm gonna wait for a lot of it to be finished and then I'll be good. But I'm pretty good with where I'm at. Got to read up a little bit, but yeah, take care.
All right.
Yeah, and I'd say the same thing. I would probably say that, yeah, I think I explained the whole I think the main thing that I kind of explained badly was just the Roderick Long minimum wage thing, or wage gap article, because I haven't read that in a while, but I can link that to you, Ignis, if you're curious. But yeah, it's been forever since I've read that article, so I haven't I probably explained it pretty poorly, but yeah. Don't be like a complete theory cell. I don't know, like don't be mean and gatekeepy, I guess. Like if people are learning and, you know, I feel like we're all here to learn, you know, and that's kind of why I kind of hate the whole debate bro attitude that a lot of like libertarians have, is that like I consider debate to be a competition, whereas like I see conversations like this to be a period for learning and growth, because
Yeah.
I want to be like open to learning and new things and being proved wrong if I am genuinely wrong, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas I see debates to be more of a competitive thing where you're basically just going to dig your heels in and, you know, hoping that you're not going to get embarrassed because someone's looking to own you over theory, you know. But hey, man, we're all just here to learn, you know. So like we have our own opinions and biases, but I'm interested in the arguments that are going to be the best. And yeah, this was super fun. I fucking this was really fun. I enjoyed this.
Yeah.
It was good talking with you, man.
But more important than anything else, make money, get bitches.
True.
Hey,
True.
true.
I think Karl Hess said something to the effect of like, if you're a libertarian and not poor, I don't know what the fuck you're doing. If you're a libertarian, you know your econ shit, you should be wealthy as shit, you know.
Yeah.
And I kind of do agree with that in the sense of like, not that like knowing Austrian econ nerdy theory is going to make you like a great businessman, because that's something different entirely.
Yeah.
But I think if you're concerned with, you know, making the world better, I think you should be, you know, trying to not make as much money as possible, but, you know, produce as much wealth as possible through whatever mechanism you feel is best to do that, you know.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh yeah, and don't forget to smash the state
All right.
for fun and profit.
Did you have any other closing thoughts, Ancat?
Oh yeah, other than hey, I got some videos up on the channel. So I have the What is Anarchism video essay. Also thanks Ignis for giving me the shout out. Appreciate it. I'm hoping to I hate how my voice sounds, so I'm just gonna like try to improve that and sound a bit louder and more energetic with my recording. I don't know. I'm new to YouTubing and video essaying shit, so I don't know. I'm hoping I can improve on that front. And then I've got like a meme video out, kind of funny, and then I also uploaded a 2-part audiobook series from a libertarian theorist called Jacques Ellul. He was this theorist in the like 1960s. He was French, you know, but he like his work is extremely based, and he wrote this book on propaganda, which is really awesome, and he just completely deconstructs propaganda as this sociological phenomenon, explain how the state wields it and how the state uses this propaganda mechanism to like wheel people to action or inaction, whether that's, you know, passive resignation to the state's, you know, decrees or whatever. But regardless, it's a really good book. It's like 16 hours long. It's really long. It's like Ignis, do you know how long a human action is?
No clue.
Okay, well,
But also
900
sorry to
pages.
say, but I gotta run as you're still
Alright.
chilling your video.
Yeah,
okay, well, yeah. I guess that's basically my final thoughts. So go check that out. Go subscribe, and yeah, it was good streaming.
All right. Well, Ignis, you can hop out, but I'm about to do my intro. Just make sure you guys check out Civil Offense on social media. You can find me at Ahmed Mlih, AHMLIH. And yeah, remember, guys, that Civil Offense is the key to winning. Thank you. Oh, gotta end the stream. It's like, the button is there. I see it there, and it's not clicking. Okay.